Amos Fortune, Free Man, Chapter 7. Hard Work Fills the Iron Kettle. That first summer in Jaffrey was a busy one. Amos and Violet worked hard together, and Celindia did what she could, for though they had been helped with the shelter, it was still far from being a home. Amos went early to the woods where trees had been felled, and with his barking mallet and peeling iron, he stripped the bark he needed from the great prostrate trunks. When he brought the slabs of bark home, it was Celindia's task to stack them in piles near the shelter where they might dry in the sun that was gaining heat and strength as the days moved on. Then, when the bark was sufficiently dry, Violet would grind it to a coarse powder in a small mill Amos had constructed so they would have on hand always a good supply of tannin. The hours of Violet's days were so filled with helping Amos that she had little time to give to her loom. Amos had erected it for her, and it took up a good part of the space in the single room of their cabin. Violet, passing it during the day, would stroke it lovingly, thinking of the comfort and beauty its fruits would someday bring to their small abode. When Celindia had finished the tasks assigned her, she would run gleefully up the hill to the common to play with the children of the town. As the season advanced, bringing each in its own time a harvest of wild berries, the children would troop off with baskets and pails in search of strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries. It was still hard for Celindia to feel that she could rightly go wherever the other children went, but Amos assured her over and over again that the world was hers to walk through, to look at and rejoice in, though he was quick to remind her that the good things were not for any one person to have, but for all to share together. Look, Papa Amos, at my pretty jewels, Celindia cried joyously when she brought home her first small bucket of bright red strawberries. Amos admired them, and Violet saw in them zest for their evening meal, but Celindia's eyes filled with tears at the thought of eating them. Only Amos' quiet assurance that there would be more for her to find tomorrow enabled the little girl to part with her riches. So Celindia enjoyed the eating of the strawberries as she had their picking, and her eyes were bright for the next day's treasure. In the brook that flowed through the woods back of their cabin, Amos built a washing place for the hides and skins. When a hide was brought to him, he let it soak in the stone basin for 3 or 4 days. Then he drew it out and turned it over to Violet, who scraped it carefully. The hair that came off, Violet would save to spin and weave into bed coverings. But the scraping was a slow process, and she would have to go over the hide long and carefully to remove all the dirt and impurities. Near the washing basin, Amos dug a pit which he kept filled with a solution of lime and water, and into which the hides and skins went after the scraping. There they remained for 2 or 3 weeks. Every day the water was drawn out and fresh water let in. Sometimes Amos thought longingly of the better equipment he had had in Woburn. There he had sweated the hide in a smokehouse, and the heat loosened the hair easily and made the skin itself more pliable. But he did not long to be back there. He had an acre of land on which he might do the work of his hand, a family to care for, and freedom like the light of day around him. He felt he knew what was good, and he had no wish to diminish present good by thinking too often of past days when work was done more easily, though no better. Amos, there's no lime in the bag, Violet announced one morning. Then we must make some, Amos replied. In the copper kettle he had brought with him from Woburn, he boiled down a solution of ground-up wood, roots, and leaves of the trees from which his tan bark was taken. Of this there was plenty in the forest, for though oak bark was best for tanning, bark of hemlock, spruce, and larch could be employed, while even the bark of alder and sumac had useful properties. In all his long years as a tanner, Amos was never more glad than he was during the first months in Jaffrey, that so much of what he had needed for his trade was at hand and could be obtained with no expenditure, save that of his time and muscle. The last piece of work he had to do before his tannery was complete was to construct a rough yard for the drying of the pelts. Once that was done, he was ready to seek business. but he did not have to look far for work. Had he been waiting for far for work had been waiting for him. By midsummer, the people of Jaffrey, with hides to be tanned, were following the road that led down from the common into the clearing. There, under the shadow of tall trees, within earshot of a running brook, they did their business with a man whose skill commanded their respect. All during the first year in Jaffrey, there was scarcely room in the cabin for anything but the tanning operations. However, by the second year, when people came to call for their leather and paid Amos fortune in cash or kind, his stock of supplies increased, and he added another room to the cabin and more comfort to their living. The iron kettle that stood half hidden in the ashes of the hearth and held the fortune savings began to be musical with the coins that were collecting in it. Amos did not know how long it would be before the contents of the kettle would be sufficient for him to buy his own piece of land. His soul might long for heaven, but his heart longed for cleared fields and a wider brook. A barn with a good-sized stall for Cyclops, and stanchions for a cow or two. A house with pretty things in it for Violet and Cindelia, and a plot of earth near the house where Violet's flowers might grow freely. He said little about his dream, but he nourished it in his heart as the best place for a dream to grow. People who came to deliver their hides would often linger to talk with the tanner. Old Amos, he was called, yet not as so much for age as his affection. A curious smile would light his face when he talked about his work or listened to others tell of theirs. And people went away from the tannery thinking enviously of how happy the blacks were. But only Violet knew that Amos lived by a dream within him, though she did not know the dream. Always she thought of him as climbing some mountain in his mind, like that great one to the west on which his eyes would dwell so often, and from which he seemed to derive something that was even more than strength. Monadnock says it will be good weather today. Amos would announce on a morning when the mountain stood clear against the sky. Monadnock says we best not leave any leather out, for there'll be storm before night, he would say when a veil of cloud like the thinnest gauze capped the mountain's crest. He knew its moods, and he talked to it as a friend, and the mountain never failed him. That's a long name, Monadnock, Cindelia said one day. What does it mean, Papa Amos? Or is it just big sounding the way Cindelia is pretty sounding? It's not a big meaning, Lindia, love, Amos told her, for they say in the Indian language it means the mountain that stands alone. Oh, Cindelia dropped her voice reverently. But ever after that, when she looked at the mountain, she felt friendlier with it. For, child as she was, she knew what it was like to stand alone. A young man came cantering up to the cabin with a packet strapped to his saddle. I've come the miles from Peterborough to find you, Amos Fortune, he said. And I want to know if I can have my hide into leather by the new year. It's as fine a cowhide as you've ever seen, and I want it tanned for breeches to wear at my wedding. Amos looked at the hide, fingering it knowingly. You can have it as soon as it's ready, but I'll not hurry leather. It's had one life. It will take time to give it another. I've heard there's a tanner in Keene. I'll take it to him and tell him I want it by the new year. The young man threatened, though he knew that Amos Fortune was the best tanner within miles, and he had no desire to take his fine hides elsewhere. Take it to him, Amos said, or leave it with me and you shall have it when the leather is ready. He smiled slyly. Would you be wanting it any sooner? The young man left the hide and rode away, and Amos went to work on it. He soaked it well, then he spread it on his beam. This was a wooden horse of convex form, one end of which rested on the floor and the other supported by two legs came up to the tanner's waist. With the hide in position, Amos worked over it with his two-handed scraper. The concave curve of the knife's edge fitted the convex surface of the beam. With a slow pushing stroke, he half shaved away, half scraped off the hair and epidermis. That done, he turned the hide over and took his two-edged fleshing knife, cleaning from the inner side all particles of animal tissue and trimming off portions of the skin that would not respond to tanning. Then Violet took the hide and put it through the next process, soaking it for 48 hours in sulfuric acid to distend the pores and render it more susceptible to the action of tanning. Amos had a succession of pits from 6 to 8 feet deep filled with solutions of tannin. Into that ooze the hide went when it was ready, and there it would stay for from 3 months to a year, depending on its weight. Every month the ooze was removed and strengthened, and every day Amos worked in it wearing heavy wooden shoes that were impervious to the tannin. Within long-handled hooks, he moved the hides and skins up and down, took them out, drained them, looked them over carefully to see how they were getting on, then put them back again. When he was satisfied that the soaking was complete, he would haul the hides out and hang them up to dry. Many of the coarser hides would be beaten until smooth with a steel instrument, but those requiring special care were passed between wooden rollers. The hide from Peterborough was such a one that Amos passed it back and forth between the rollers until it was soft and pliant. The work was done in good time for the young man's wedding day, and Amos was glad to have it finished for him and before the cold weather came. During the winter months, it was hard to work on big pieces for the cold and freezing in the pits, and Amos saved that time for work on lighter skins and kits that never went into the pits at all, but were tawn with alum and salt, with the yolk of an egg added if there was any, if it were to be finished white. Amos' working week began at sunrise on Monday morning and continued till sunset every day through Saturday. One whole day he kept free Sunday, and that was sacred to church-going and to family life. Work and all its signs and reminders were set as far aside as possible on that day, while he thought and his time were given elsewhere. He put off the leather breeches that were worn daily and put on velvet ones with silver buckles at his knees and on his toes. The striped vest he had worn for his wedding was donned for the Lord's Day. He brushed his fur hat and set it on his hair, and now that was now as white as the first snows of Monadnock. In the winter, he wore a fur coat, and in the summer, a deep blue straight-bodied coat. Then, with Violet in her quiet best, and Celinda in as pretty a frock as any little girl in Jaffrey, they would walk up the hill to the meeting house. A special pew was reserved for the blacks in the gallery, and up the narrow stairs they would go to it. Amos smiled broadly, and Violet bowed demurely as they met others of their race with whom they shared the pew. Pompey Blackman, a friend of Amos's since the Woburn days, who had served 5 years in the Revolutionary War and come back with his own freedom and a fund of stories to tell, was always there. Sometimes Caesar Freeman or Fortune Little would be present, having ridden over from Dublin. But it was the Perdoos family that took up most of the pew, shivering with cold in the winter, pale with hunger in the summer. The little ones were always more ready to cling to Amos than their father, and their mother Lois turned longingly to words about heaven, for she had wearied of finding any peace on earth. With eager interest they listened to the fine young preacher, Laban Ainsworth, who had been ordained minister in the winter of 1782. Imposing and fiery, challenging and inspired, his words on a Sunday were as forceful as his life on a weekday. For though his right arm was useless, he was able to handle a team of oxen, hew down a tree, or plant a field. His words carried meaning, and his congregation was the richer for hearing them. Amos liked to listen, but he liked equally well the time after meeting, when people gathered outdoors, bowing to each other, shaking hands, and exchanging news fitting for the Sabbath. It was a good life he was leading, Amos thought as he took stock of it from time to time, and though it was a hard-working life, it was not without its joys. The greatest of these came on a day some 8 years after his arrival in Jaffrey, when he became a member of the church he had attended so faithfully. Amos cherished certain papers always, and among them was that of dismission from his church in Woburn and recommendation by them for his membership elsewhere. He had shown the paper to Deacons Beaufort and Parson Ainsworth during his first year in Jaffrey, but it was not until May 1789, when the church met for the transaction of routine business, that it was voted to receive Amos Fortune into communion. "What a pity he isn't white," one of the elders commented as Amos left the meeting house. "He could do so much for the church." Amos did not hear, nor would have cared if he had. He knew what the church had done for him, and he was glad that membership was at last would forge him into closer union. With a smile on his face, he soon astride Cyclops with Violet riding pillion behind him and Celindia's thin legs straddling the saddle before him. He wanted to share his good news with some of his own people. Down the Squantum village road they journeyed, and though the season was well advanced into spring, the wind had an edge to it, and it came across the newly sown fields. Amos thought with pleasure of the warmth awaiting them in the Perdoos cabin. 5 years had passed since Moses Perdoos, the blacksmith, had died, and Lois was having an ever harder struggle in bringing up her brood of children. Amos went to see her often, hoping that some of the good of his own life might spill over into hers, that was hedged round by poverty and misfortune. Violet had small liking and less symmetry than Lois. She scorned Lois's inability to care for her family and to rise above the conditions of her life. But she always accompanied Amos on his visits, though she kept her silence. The Perdoos family were singing when the Fortune family arrived. The mournful sound drifted through the closed door out to the road. Amos put his finger on his lips as he and Violet walked quietly up to the door, and Celindia tiptoed behind them. He pushed the door open, and they stood on the threshold unobserved. The Perdoos were all in a group by the hearth. Lois sat with the younger on her lap, and the other children gathered around her, Polly and Moses, Philip and Sally. For the length of the song, the visitors standing on the threshold made no move. "Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see, comin' for to carry me home? A band of angels comin' after me, comin' for to carry me home. If you get there before I do, comin' for to carry me home, tell all my friends I'm comin' there too, comin' for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home." The wistful voices around the fire sang. But when it came to the last chorus, Amos nudged Violet and Celindia, and they joined in. The Perdoos family turned around and stared, though they never ceased singing. When the song came to its end, the children flew across the room to bring the visitors to the fireside. "Uncle Amos, will you tell us a story?" "A story, Uncle Amos? Please, oh please!" they begged in their high, shrill voices. "Yes, I'll tell you a story," he agreed quietly. "About that song you've been singing about Africa." "About Africa?" They chippered their voices, sounding like a bevy of birds. For Africa was in a way none of them could explain, linked up with heaven, and they thought the two places with the same reverence and ultimate longing. Sitting on a low stool by the fire was the Perdoos children, and Celindia as close to him as they could be. He told them a story. The firelight in his face made it shine so that Violet's eyes filled with tears at the goodness that was hers, and Lois's eyes filled with tears for the goodness she was heart-hungry for and felt she would never have. "One time there was a traveler man way away in Africa," Amos began. His voice had a lilt in it that encouraged the children to make a humming sound to go along with it. "And he said he heard the natives sitting around their fires singing that song. Yes, singing that song as they sat around their fires. He asked them about it, and they told him that another tribe living near the Great Falls had a custom that when their chief was about to die, yes, about to die, that old man that had served them well, they placed him in his own canoe." Amos paused for a moment, but the undertone of humming went on. "They set him up straight with all his trappings to mark his rank and all the food he would need for his journey. Then they set the canoe afloat in midstream. Yes, in the midstream of the river, they set it floating, far, far from shore, and they headed it for the falls and the white column of mist that rises away from them. Then the tribe on shore sang the song you've been singing as a farewell to their chief. They could not weep, for he was going the way all men must go, yes, the very way. And they must send him on with strength and not sadness. And so they sang, though their hearts were full of longing, for their chief was a good man, and they loved him. When the canoe drew near the brink of the falls, yes, the very brink of the falls, from which the column of mist was ever rising, they saw their chief stand up in it. Tall and straight he stood, and his arms reached upward. As he stood there, a chariot came down out of the mist and bore him up high. Yes, bore him heavenward, further than they could see, but to the place their hearts were hungering after, and where they knew they would meet him in time to come. Amos Fortune's low voice came to a stop, but there was a breathless wonder in the faces looking into his. Amos reached out and took Polly's right hand in his left. He took hold of Philip's left hand in his right. Then all the other children, linked together in a circle, was formed. Amos began to sing, deep river, Lord, deep river, Lord. I want to cross over in a calm time. They knew the song, so they joined in together with him. Without words, they hummed the song through again. Then they dropped hands and looked expectantly at Amos. He said to them quietly, why don't you all go out and see who can hear the first whippoorwill? Because there was something in his words that made the children want to follow him, they raced to the door, their bare feet thudding as quietly on the floor as on the sandy soil outside. Lois had her head in her hands and was sobbing softly to herself. Violet took the youngest up in her arms and held the child tenderly while Amos spoke to Lois. Things going hard for you, Lois? She nodded her head. Harder and harder as the years go by. When Moses was here, it was cruel enough, but now he's gone, it's even crueler. Nothing to eat, nothing to buy food with, helped out by the town until they're tired of helping me. She sighed wearily. Soon the children will be taken from me. Polly will be the first to go, then they'll all be gone. I've not got the strength to go on living, Amos, she said. Amos talked to her soothingly for a while, and when he was ready to leave, he told her to send Moses and Philip over to him, for they could help in the tannery and he would pay them a penny a day. Her eyes brightened as if the coins had flashed in the firelight. Paul will be cared for, Amos said, and so will you. After he had gone, Lois Perdoos felt comforted, though she could not say from whence or how, since nothing in her life had changed. That night, Violet heard Amos counting the coins in the iron kettle, unfolding the paper notes. She guessed what he was going to do, and she knew what he was going to do. Never in her life before had she questioned what Amos did, but he had given her freedom when he had made her his wife, and she was determined to use her freedom now. She said nothing that night, pretending she was asleep when he got in bed beside her, under the coverlet she had spun and woven. You asleep, Violet? He asked. His voice was so kind that she could hardly bear the deception she must practice to feign sleep. She must not move, fearful to breathe, fearful almost not to breathe. She heard his familiar prayer ending with, Good night, Lord. Then she heard his even breathing long before she was asleep, but she did not weaken in her resolve. The next morning, when he was in the ooze of the pit, she took the iron kettle from the ashes of the hearth and buried it in the woods, marking the spot well, but marking it so that only she would know it.